It was one of those nights in Chicago when the sky didn't just rain, it wept. Cold, heavy drops fell like tears from a sky that had given up on kindness. The wind cut through coats like paper, and the sidewalk shimmered under the yellow streetlights, slick with puddles that reflected the city's exhaustion. Most people were tucked inside, wrapped in blankets or hunched over steaming mugs, grateful for dry socks and warm walls, but not him. He stood outside a 24-hour diner on the south side, soaked to the bone, holding a little girl no older than 3 in his arms. Her tiny face was buried in his chest, her pink jacket soaked through, her sneakers squishing with every slight shift of her weight. He hadn't slept in 2 days, not really. Not since the landlord changed the locks that morning. Not since he'd packed what little they had into a single duffel bag and walked away from the only home his daughter had ever known. He'd lost his job 6 weeks earlier. The company, a small logistics firm, had folded quietly without warning, like a tired sigh. He'd been the last one out, turning off the lights, wondering how he'd explain to his daughter that Daddy couldn't buy her favorite strawberry yogurt anymore. His wife, well, she'd been gone for over a year now. Cancer, fast and cruel. One day she was humming in the kitchen. The next she was gone, leaving behind an empty chair at the dinner table and a silence so loud it hurt to breathe. Now, standing in the rain with his daughter shivering against him, he felt the weight of everything pressing down. Bills, grief, fear, shame. He'd applied to dozens of jobs. Temp work, warehouse gigs, even dishwashing. But with no permanent address and a gap in his resume, doors kept closing. He'd sold his laptop, his winter coat, even his wedding ring. Still, it wasn't enough. And tonight, with nowhere to go and his daughter's eyelids fluttering with exhaustion, he'd walked for miles, hoping to find a shelter with an open bed. But they were all full. His legs gave out just outside the diner. Not dramatically, just a slow collapse like a building finally surrendering to gravity. He sank onto the wet curb, pulling his daughter close, wrapping his arms around her like a human blanket. "It's okay, baby," he whispered, though his voice cracked. "We're gonna be okay." He didn't believe it, but he had to say it, for her. Inside the diner, past the fogged-up windows and the neon open sign flickering like a tired heartbeat, a young woman wiped down the counter. She'd been working the overnight shift for months now, nursing school during the day, diner at night. Her feet ached, her eyes burned, and her bank account was thinner than the napkins she handed out. But she showed up, every night, because someone had to. She glanced out the window while refilling the coffee pot and saw them, the man and the little girl, huddled on the curb like 2 lost birds. Something in her chest tightened. She'd seen hardship before. Grew up in a neighborhood where eviction notices were as common as grocery flyers. She knew that look, the hollow eyes, the slumped shoulders, the way someone holds a child like they're the only thing keeping them from floating away. Without thinking, she untied her apron, grabbed 2 thick wool blankets from the back closet left behind by a regular who never came back, and pushed open the diner door. The cold hit her like a slap, but she didn't flinch. She walked straight to them, crouching down so she was eye level with the man. "Hey," she said softly. "You two can't stay out here." He looked up, startled, rain dripping from his eyebrows. His eyes were red-rimmed, not just from the cold. We don't have money," he mumbled, voice rough. "Just need a place to sit for a bit." "You can sit inside," she said. "Warm up, no charge," he hesitated. Pride maybe, or fear of being turned away again. But the little girl whimpered softly, and that decided it. He nodded. She helped him up. His arm was trembling and guided them inside. The warmth hit like a hug. The smell of coffee, grease, and cinnamon rolls wrapped around them. She led them to a booth in the back, far from the few other customers, and draped the blankets over their shoulders. Then she brought 2 mugs of hot chocolate, extra marshmallows for the girl, and a plate of grilled cheese sandwiches. "Eat," she said gently. "You look like you haven't in a while." He tried to thank her, but words stuck in his throat. Instead, he watched as his daughter, still wrapped in the blanket, took a small bite of sandwich and smiled, a real sleepy smile. It was the first time he'd seen her smile in days. The young woman sat across from them, not too close, just enough to show she wasn't leaving. "My name's Elena," she said. "I work here nights." He gave a small nod. "Thanks, Elena." She didn't ask for his story. Didn't pry. Just let them be. But as she watched the little girl drift off against her father's shoulder, something stirred in her. She remembered her own childhood, Her mom working double shifts, the nights they ate beans and rice because that's all they had, the time her little brother got sick and they couldn't afford the copay. She knew what it felt like to be one step from falling. When her shift ended at 5 a.m., she came back to the booth. The man was still awake, staring into his empty mug like it held answers. "There's a motel 2 blocks down," she said, pulling out her wallet. "It's clean, safe. I've sent people there before." She pressed $40 into his hand, 2 crumpled 20s, all she had until payday. "Take it, get a room, rest." He stared at the money like it was gold. "I can't." "You can," she interrupted gently. "And you will." He looked at her then, not just at her but really looked, saw the tired lines around her eyes, the calluses on her hands, the quiet strength in her voice, and for the first time in months he felt seen, not as a failure, not as a burden, just as a person trying his best. "Why?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Why help us?" She smiled, small but real. "Because someone once did the same for me, and because your daughter deserves a dry bed tonight." He didn't argue. He took the money. Walked to the motel. Got a room. Watched his daughter sleep in a real bed for the first time in days, her breathing slow and steady. And he cried. Not from sadness, but from the shock of being cared for when he had nothing to give in return. Back at the diner, Elena clocked out and walked home in the early morning light. The rain had stopped. The city was quiet, holding its breath before the rush of a new day. She didn't think much of what she'd done. It was just what you do. You see someone drowning, you throw a rope, even if your own hands are shaking. She didn't know it then, but that rainy night would stitch their lives together in ways neither could imagine. Years later, when the world would try to break her, he'd be the one throwing the rope back. But for now, in that moment, there was only kindness, simple, quiet, and human. And sometimes that's enough to change everything. Life doesn't fix itself overnight. Not after you've been knocked down hard. But sometimes all it takes is one person believing in you, even for just a few minutes, to give you the strength to try again. After that night at the diner, the man didn't magically get his life back on track, but something had shifted inside him. That small act of kindness, $40, a warm meal, a quiet "you matter," planted a seed. He checked into the motel, stayed 3 nights, and used every hour to think, plan, and breathe. He held his daughter close each morning and whispered, "We're going to be okay." And this time he almost believed it himself. He started with the basics. He found a day shelter that offered showers and laundry. He cleaned up, dressed neatly, and walked into every temp agency within 5 miles. He took any job he could, stocking shelves, moving furniture, cleaning offices after midnight. The pay was low, the hours brutal, but it was something, and every Friday, no matter how tired he was, he walked past the diner on his way home, just to see if the young woman was working. He never went in. He didn't want to burden her, but he wanted to say thank you properly, when he had something real to show for himself. Meanwhile, she kept working nights at the diner while studying during the day. Nursing school wasn't easy. There were exams, clinical rotations, and moments when she wondered if she'd made a mistake. But she remembered why she'd chosen this path, because she'd seen too many people suffer in silence, too many families fall apart under the weight of illness and bills. She wanted to be someone who helped carry that weight, even just a little. Months passed. Seasons changed. Snow melted into spring, and the city bloomed with cautious hope. One evening, as she wiped down tables after closing, she saw him standing outside again. But this time he wasn't soaked or broken. He wore clean clothes, his hair was trimmed, and his daughter stood beside him holding a small drawing in her hand. He looked nervous, like he wasn't sure if he should come in. She opened the door before he could turn away. "You came back," she said, smiling. "I wanted to thank you," he said, voice steady now, not just with words. He handed her an envelope. Inside was the $40 folded neatly and a note that read, "You gave me more than money. You gave me hope. I'll never forget it." She didn't take the money back. "Keep it," she said gently. "Use it for her." She nodded toward his daughter, who was now coloring on a napkin at a nearby booth. They talked for a while that night, just 20 minutes before her shift ended, but it was enough. He told her about the warehouse job he'd landed, the tiny apartment he'd rented with 2 roommates, how his daughter had started preschool. She told him about her upcoming finals, how she dreamed of working in a community clinic one day. There was no grand plan, no promises, just two people sharing pieces of their lives like passing a warm cup on a cold day. That conversation became a quiet thread between them. Every few weeks he'd stop by the diner during her shift. Sometimes they'd talk for 5 minutes, sometimes 15. He never asked for help again. Instead, he listened, really listened when she talked about her struggles. And she in turn celebrated his small wins like they were her own. One night, after a particularly rough week, his boss had yelled at him in front of everyone, and his daughter had a fever. He sat in the booth looking defeated. She brought him coffee and sat across from him. "You're doing better than you think," she said. "You're showing up. Every single day. That's courage." He looked up surprised. "I don't feel courageous." "Courage isn't about not being scared," she said. "It's about being scared and doing it anyway. And you're doing it for her." She pointed to his daughter asleep in the booth with her head on a folded jacket. "That's the bravest thing I know." Those words stayed with him. A few months later, he saw a flyer at the library, free night classes in computer basics. He'd always been decent with tech, fixed his old laptop more times than he could count, but he'd never thought of it as a career. Still, something about it called to him. Maybe it was the idea of building something, not just fixing things. Maybe it was the promise of a future where he wouldn't have to choose between rent and groceries. He signed up. The classes were tough. He was older than most students, exhausted from work, and often fell asleep over his textbooks. But he kept going. His daughter would sit beside him at the kitchen table, coloring quietly while he practiced coding exercises on a second-hand laptop donated by the program. "Daddy's learning magic," she'd tell her teacher, and he'd smile even when he felt like giving up. Elena noticed the change. When he came into the diner, his eyes were sharper, his posture straighter. He talked about algorithms and user interfaces like they were real things he could touch. She didn't understand half of it, but she loved seeing him light up. "You should start your own thing," she said one night, half joking. "Build an app or something," he laughed. "And me? I can barely keep my phone charged." But the idea stuck. Years went by. His daughter started elementary school. He moved into a one-bedroom apartment, just the two of them. He got a better job at a small tech support company, then another at a startup. He saved every extra dollar, skipped vacations, bought secondhand clothes, but he never skipped his daughter's school plays or parent-teacher conferences. At night, after she was asleep, he'd work on a side project, an app that connected single parents with local resources, food pantries, free counseling, after-school programs, emergency childcare. He'd seen too many parents like himself drowning in silence, not knowing where to turn. He wanted to build a lifeline. He called it Pathway. It started as a simple website built on weekends and late nights. He tested it with other parents at his daughter's school. They loved it. One mom cried when she found a free dental clinic for her son. Another used it to get help with rent after her husband left. The feedback poured in, not just gratitude, but ideas, suggestions, hope. Encouraged, he quit his job. It was terrifying. No paycheck, no safety net, just a dream and a laptop. But he believed in Pathway, and so did a few early investors who saw its potential. Within 2 years, Pathway grew. Not into some flashy Silicon Valley giant, but into a respected, mission-driven company that actually helped people. He hired a small team, mostly single parents themselves, and made sure everyone had flexible hours, mental health days, and paid family leave. "We're not just building software," he told his team. "We're building dignity." He became known in certain circles not for being flashy, but for being real. At conferences, he'd talk about grief, resilience, and the power of small kindnesses. People listened, not because he was polished, but because he spoke from the heart. Through it all, he never forgot the diner. He visited less often as his schedule filled, but he always sent a note on Elena's birthday. And every December, he donated enough to keep the diner's community meal program running through the winter. Free hot meals for anyone who walked in, no questions asked. Elena, meanwhile, graduated top of her nursing class. She landed a job at a trauma center downtown, then later moved to a community health clinic in a neighborhood much like the one she grew up in. She worked with patients who had nowhere else to go, homeless veterans, single moms, elderly folks living alone. She listened to their stories, held their hands, and fought for them when the system failed. She never sought the spotlight. Her reward was in the quiet moments, a patient's first smile after surgery, a teenager finally opening up about their anxiety, a grandmother hugging her after a tough diagnosis. She carried that same quiet strength she'd shown that rainy night, steady, kind, unwavering. She heard about his success through the news once. Local CEO launches mental health initiative for single parents. And felt a swell of pride. Not because she'd helped him, but because he'd helped so many others. That was the point, wasn't it? Kindness wasn't meant to be repaid. It was meant to be passed on. They didn't talk much during those years. Life got busy. But the thread between them never broke. It just stretched, quiet but strong, like a bridge built of shared humanity. And neither of them knew that soon. The roles would reverse, that the one who once gave shelter would need shelter herself, and the one who once received it would be ready to give it back. But for now, in this season of their lives, they were both exactly where they needed to be, healing, helping, and quietly changing the world. One small act at a time. Life has a way of circling back, sometimes gently, sometimes like a storm you never saw coming. For years, everything seemed to be moving forward. The man who once sat shivering on a curb now ran a company that helped thousands of families find stability. His daughter was in middle school, bright-eyed and full of dreams, and their home was filled with laughter, homework, and the smell of pancakes on Sunday mornings. He still worked long hours, but now it was by choice, not desperation. He'd built something real, not just a business, but a community. She, the young woman from the diner, had become a respected nurse in her clinic. She knew her patients by name, remembered their kids' birthdays, and always had an extra granola bar in her bag for someone who hadn't eaten. Her days were long, often emotionally heavy, but she never lost that quiet fire, the belief that everyone deserved to be seen, heard, and treated with dignity. But then, everything changed in the span of a single week. It started with a phone call, late at night. Her younger brother, home from 2 tours overseas, had been at a gas station when an argument broke out between 2 strangers. He'd tried to step in, calm things down. That's what he always did. He'd seen too much violence. He hated seeing more. But in the chaos, someone pulled out a phone and started recording. The video was shaky, grainy, but it spread like wildfire. Within hours, it was on social media. Headlines twisted the story. Veteran attacks man at gas station, one read. Ex-soldier goes off the rails, said another. No one asked for the full truth. No one waited for facts. The internet had already decided he was guilty. Her brother had PTSD, he startled easily. Sometimes loud noises sent him into a panic. That night someone had shouted and he'd raised his hands not to strike but to shield himself. But the camera didn't catch that part. It only showed a big man in a hoodie moving quickly, and that was enough for strangers to turn him into a monster. She tried to explain. She posted the full police report. She shared statements from witnesses. But the noise drowned her out. Trolls flooded her social media. They called her a liar, said she was covering for a dangerous thug. Someone dug up her work address and posted it online with a message. This is where the traitor works. Then came the threats. Anonymous calls in the middle of the night. Notes slipped under her clinic door. One said, "You protect him, we protect the truth." It wasn't truth they wanted. It was blood. Her clinic, trying to avoid controversy, placed her on temporary leave pending review. It wasn't punishment. They said just protocol, but it felt like betrayal. After years of showing up for others, she was being pushed aside because of something she didn't even do. Worse, her landlord, nervous about the online attention, told her she had to move out. It's not personal, he said, avoiding her eyes. But people are talking. Just like that, the ground vanished beneath her feet. She packed her things into boxes, not knowing where she'd go. Her brother was staying with a friend, ashamed and withdrawn, refusing to leave his room. She wanted to be strong for him, but inside she was crumbling. She scrolled through her phone one night, exhausted, tears blurring the screen. She thought about calling old friends, but she didn't want to drag them into this mess. She thought about her parents, but they were elderly and already worried sick. Then, almost without thinking, her thumb hovered over a contact she hadn't called in nearly 5 years. Him. She hadn't spoken to him since that Christmas card he'd sent with a note. Still using your diner coffee as my gold standard. Hope you're well. She'd smiled, tucked it into her journal, and gone on with her life. Now she hesitated. Was it fair to reach out? He had his own life, his company, his daughter, responsibilities. She didn't want to burden him. But the loneliness was crushing. And deep down she remembered how he'd looked that night in the diner, broken but not beyond saving. Maybe, just maybe, he'd understand. She took a breath and pressed call. He answered on the first ring. "Hey," he said, voice warm, like no time had passed. "I was just thinking about you." She didn't know how to start. The words tangled in her throat. But then she heard her own voice, small and shaky. I don't know who else to call." And she told him everything. He didn't interrupt. Didn't offer empty platitudes. Just listened. When she finished, there was a quiet pause. Then he said, "I'm getting on a plane tonight." "No," she said quickly. "You don't have to." "I do," he cut in gently. "Because you once gave me a place to land when I had nowhere else to go. Now it's my turn." 24 hours later, he was standing on her doorstep in Chicago, duffel bag in hand, his daughter staying with a trusted friend back home. He didn't bring flowers or grand speeches. He brought groceries, a change of clothes, and a calm certainty that said, "You're not alone." He saw the fear in her eyes, the exhaustion in her posture. He didn't ask for details right away. Instead, he made tea, sat at her kitchen table, and said, "Tell me what you need. Not what you think you should ask for. What you actually need." She looked at him, really looked, and for the first time in weeks felt like she could breathe. "I need someone to believe me," she whispered. "I do," he said simply. "Always have." Over the next few days, he didn't just offer comfort, he took action. Quietly, efficiently. He called his legal team, people who specialized in digital defamation and wrongful accusations. He reached out to a public relations firm that worked with non-profits, not celebrities, and asked them to help tell the real story. He used his platform, not to shout, but to share facts, witness statements, and resources about PTSD and veteran support. He also did something she never expected. He paid her rent for the next 6 months, not as a handout, but as a bridge. "Consider it an investment," he told her. "In you, in your brother, in the truth." But more than any of that, he showed up. Every evening, after working remotely from her tiny guest room, he'd sit with her on the couch. They'd talk about nothing important. Childhood memories, bad TV shows, the way rain sounds different in the city versus the suburbs. Sometimes they'd just sit in silence, watching the streetlights flicker on outside. And in those moments, she remembered why she'd called him in the first place. Not because he had money or power, but because he understood what it meant to be human in a world that often forgets. One night, after a particularly brutal day of online harassment, she broke down. "I feel like I've lost everything," she sobbed. "My job, my home, my brother's trust, even my sense of who I am." He handed her a tissue and said, "You haven't lost who you are. You're still the person who gave a stranger $40 in the rain. That doesn't disappear because the world gets loud." She looked at him, tears streaming. "Why are you doing all this?" He smiled a little sadly. "Because kindness isn't a debt. It's a promise. And I promised myself that if I ever had the chance to shield someone the way you shielded me, I would." She didn't know it yet, but his presence was already changing the tide. His team uncovered security footage from a nearby store that showed the full incident. Her brother stepping between two men, hands up, trying to de-escalate. The real aggressor was someone else entirely. When the footage was released, public opinion began to shift. News outlets issued corrections. Apologies trickled in. Too little, too late for some, but enough to start clearing the air. Her clinic invited her back. Her landlord offered her old apartment again with a sincere apology. And slowly, carefully, her brother began to speak. To counselors, to family, to himself. But none of that would have happened without that first call. Without someone choosing to believe in her when the world had turned its back. As the storm began to quiet, she realized something. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was being held. And sometimes that's the only thing that keeps a person from falling apart. She looked at him one evening, stirring soup on the stove, and felt a deep, quiet gratitude. Not just for what he'd done, but for who he'd become. And she knew without a doubt that the kindness she'd given on a rainy night all those years ago hadn't just saved him. It had come full circle. And now, it was saving her too. He didn't come in with a cape or a speech. He just showed up, quiet, steady, and ready to stand beside her when the whole world felt like it was closing in. And that made all the difference. After that first week of him being in town, things started to shift. Not all at once, but like the slow turn of a tide. He didn't take over. He didn't make decisions for her. Instead, he asked questions. What do you want to happen? Who do you trust? What would feel like justice to you and your brother? He listened more than he spoke, and when he did act, it was with precision, not panic. His legal team moved fast but carefully. They filed a formal request for all available footage from nearby businesses, not just the gas station. They tracked down the two men who'd been arguing that night, both of whom, once contacted, admitted the veteran had tried to calm things down, not start a fight. One even said, he probably saved someone from getting hurt. The PR team he brought in didn't spin a story. They simply shared the facts, clear, calm, and backed by evidence. They posted the full security video from the convenience store across the street, time-stamped and unedited. They included statements from mental health professionals about how PTSD can affect behavior, not to excuse anything, but to explain it. And they highlighted his service record. 8 years overseas, 2 Purple Hearts, a letter of commendation from his unit commander. Within days, the narrative began to change. Local news outlets ran follow-up pieces. A veterans advocacy group picked up the story. Online, the same people who'd hurled insults started apologizing. Some deleted their posts. Others sent private messages. I'm sorry I believed the worst. It wasn't perfect, some voices still shouted lies in the dark corners of the internet. But the noise of truth was finally louder. But he knew that fixing the public story wasn't enough. She needed to feel safe again in her home, in her work, in her own skin. So he did something small but powerful. He helped her move, not back to her old apartment, but to a quiet building on the north side, recommended by a friend who managed properties. It was secure, with a locked entrance and kind neighbors. He paid the first 6 months up front, not as charity but as a practical step so she could focus on healing, not bills. Think of it as a loan, he said with a half smile. Pay me back in grilled cheese sandwiches someday. She laughed for the first time in weeks. He also made sure her brother had support. He connected him with a nonprofit that specialized in veteran mental health. Real counselors, not just hotlines. He arranged for transportation to appointments, even sat with him during the first session when the young man was too nervous to go alone. I've been where you are, he told him gently. Not the same path, but the same feeling, like you don't belong in your own life anymore. You do, you just need time. Her brother didn't say much that day, but he nodded. And a week later he texted her, "Thanks for not giving up on me." At the clinic, things were trickier. Even though the facts were clear, some staff still looked at her sideways. Rumors don't vanish just because they're proven wrong. They linger like smoke. But he didn't let her face it alone. He called the clinic's director, not as a CEO, but as a concerned friend, and asked what could be done to restore trust. Not with pressure, but with partnership. They agreed on a plan. She'd return part-time at first, working with patients who knew her well. She'd also help design a new training module for staff on trauma-informed care, especially for families affected by military service or public scrutiny. It turned her pain into purpose and gave her back her professional dignity, not as a favor but as earned ground. Evenings were the hardest. That's when the fear crept back in. The what-ifs, the memories of hate-filled messages, the sound of her phone buzzing with unknown numbers. But he made sure she wasn't alone. He'd cook dinner, badly but with heart, while she sat at the table grading patient notes or reading. Sometimes they'd watch old movies, the kind with happy endings and no villains. Other times they'd just talk. One night, over a pot of slightly burnt soup, she asked, "Why are you doing all this? You've got your own life, your company, your daughter. You didn't have to drop everything." He stirred the soup, not looking up right away. "Remember that night in the diner? You didn't know me. You didn't owe me anything. But you saw a person in trouble and you helped. Not because you expected something back, just because it was the right thing to do." He finally met her eyes. "Now I see someone in trouble. And I get to do the right thing too. That's not sacrifice. That's honor." She swallowed hard. "I was scared to call you. I thought you'd say no. Or worse, that you'd say yes out of pity." "No," he said firmly. "It's not pity. It's respect. You've spent your whole life caring for people who are hurting. Now it's okay for you to be the one who's hurting, and it's okay for someone to care for you." Those words settled deep inside her, like a stone finally finding the bottom of a restless lake. As the weeks passed, she began to sleep through the night. She started smiling at her patients again, not the polite kind, but the real ones that reached her eyes. She even went for a walk in the park one Sunday, just her and her brother, no masks, no looking over their shoulders. The sun was warm.
Kids were laughing on the swings.
For the first time in months, the world felt soft again. He stayed longer than he'd planned, 3 weeks instead of 1. His team handled things back at the office. His daughter video called every night asking about Aunt Elena and sending drawings of the two of them as superheroes. "You're the shield," she told him. "She's the heart." When it was finally time for him to go back, she walked him to the train station. They didn't say much, just stood there for a moment in the early morning light, the city waking up around them. "You'll be okay?" he asked. She nodded. "Because of you." "No," he corrected gently. "Because of you. I just reminded you that you're not alone." She hugged him then, long and tight. Not out of desperation, but gratitude, the kind that doesn't need words. After he left, she didn't fall apart. She kept going. She returned to full-time work. She helped her brother find a job at a local auto shop that hired veterans. She even started volunteering again, at a shelter for families in crisis, serving meals on weekends. But something had changed inside her. She wasn't just helping others to prove her worth. She was helping because she finally believed she deserved to be helped too, and she carried his words with her like a compass. Kindness isn't a debt. It's a promise. Now she understood what that really meant. It wasn't about keeping score. It was about passing the light forward, so that no one has to sit in the rain alone. She didn't know it yet, but this chapter wasn't the end. It was the bridge to something bigger, because healing doesn't stop with one person. It ripples, and soon they'd both be part of something that would help thousands more. But for now, in this quiet moment, she stood on solid ground, dry, warm, and finally free. Time has a way of stitching broken pieces into something stronger. Not perfect, just more honest, more real. And sometimes, the people who once saved each other become the ones who build something new together. Not out of obligation, but out of shared understanding. A year after the storm passed, life had settled into a new rhythm. She was back at the clinic, not just as a nurse, but as a voice for change. She'd helped create a support group for healthcare workers who'd faced online harassment or public scrutiny, because she'd learned that silence only gives fear more power. Her brother was working steady hours, seeing a counselor regularly, and even mentoring other veterans. He still carried his pain, but now he carried hope too. He, meanwhile, had returned to his company with a renewed sense of purpose. The experience had shown him how fragile reputation could be, and how quickly someone could be cast out, even when they'd done nothing wrong. He began rethinking Pathway, his original app. It was good, but it wasn't enough. People didn't just need resources, they needed protection, advocacy, and community when the world turned against them. One evening, over a video call that stretched into the night, they talked about it. Not as the man who'd been saved and the woman who'd saved him, but as two people who'd both been through fire and come out the other side with scars and wisdom. "What if we built something together?" he asked. "Not just an app, a whole network. For families who are drowning in systems that don't see them, whether it's mental health, legal trouble, job loss, or just being misunderstood." She leaned forward, eyes lighting up. "A place where people aren't judged first? Where help comes before headlines?" "Exactly," he said. "Where someone like your brother gets support before the internet decides his fate. Where someone like me years ago doesn't have to sleep on a curb because no one knew he existed." They didn't rush it. They spent months talking to social workers, lawyers, therapists, single parents, veterans, and teachers. They listened more than they spoke. They asked, "What's missing?" and "What would have helped you?" The answers were always the same: dignity, speed, and someone who believes in you before you believe in yourself. And so, slowly, carefully, they built it. They called it Anchor. Not because it held people down, but because it kept them from drifting away when the current got too strong. Anchor wasn't just a website or a hotline. It was a living network. Local volunteers trained in crisis response, legal navigators who could explain rights in plain language, mental health counselors available within 24 hours, and emergency housing partners who asked no questions, just offered a bed. They launched it quietly in Chicago first. No press, no fanfare, just word of mouth through clinics, shelters, schools, and community centers. Within 3 months, they'd helped over 200 families. A mom fleeing domestic violence found safe housing the same day she called. A teenager struggling with anxiety got connected to a free therapist before his grades dropped further. A retired teacher, scammed out of her savings, received legal help that recovered half her money. People started calling it the lifeline that answers. Then came the night of the gala. It wasn't fancy, just a community center downtown, strung with fairy lights and filled with folding chairs. But the room was packed, not with investors or celebrities, but with the people Anchor had helped. Single parents, veterans, nurses, teachers, kids who'd slept in cars and now had beds of their own. She stood near the back, watching him prepare to speak. He looked nervous, more nervous than he'd been pitching to venture capitalists, because this wasn't about money, it was about meaning. When he stepped up to the mic, the room fell quiet. He didn't start with stats or success stories. He started with truth. 10 years ago, he said, voice low but steady, I was standing outside a diner in the rain. I had nothing, no job, no home, just my little girl in my arms and the crushing weight of feeling like I'd failed her. I thought no one saw me, but someone did. He looked across the room right at her. She felt her throat tighten. You saved me once, he said, and the words hung in the air like a promise kept, not with grand gestures, just with soup, a blanket, and $40. But more than that, you saw me as a person, not a problem. He paused, took a breath. Now it's my turn to shield you. And not just you, but everyone in this room who's ever felt invisible, blamed, or broken, because kindness isn't a debt you pay back. It's a promise you pass forward. The room didn't erupt in applause right away. People were crying, hugging, nodding like they finally understood they weren't alone. Afterward, she walked up to him. No words were needed. They just stood there side by side, watching a young mother hug her child near the refreshment table, same age as his daughter had been that rainy night. She's safe now, she said softly. Because of you, he replied. Because of us, they didn't become famous. Anchor never made headlines in national papers, but in neighborhoods across the city and soon other cities, it became a quiet force. Churches hosted training sessions. High school students volunteered as first responders for peers in crisis. Local businesses donated space, time, and supplies. Most importantly, people began to trust again, not in systems, but in each other. Years later, long after Anchor had grown into a national network, someone asked them what made it work when so many similar efforts failed. It's simple, she'd say. We don't wait for people to prove they deserve help. We assume they do. And we remember, he'd add, that everyone is one bad day away from needing a hand, and one good person away from getting back on their feet. Their story never became a movie. There were no dramatic speeches on rooftops or last-minute courtroom victories. Just two ordinary people who chose again and again to show up for each other, and then for others. On quiet nights when the world felt heavy, she'd still think back to that diner. And he'd remember the motel room, the smell of dry blankets, the sound of his daughter breathing peacefully for the first time in days. Those moments weren't just memories. They were reminders that no act of kindness is ever wasted, that no person is ever truly alone. If someone's willing to look up from their own storm and say, come in, you're safe here. And that sometimes the greatest legacy isn't what you build, but who you help rise along the way. In the end, they didn't just save each other, they built a world where others could be saved too, and that was more than enough.